And before I introduce our special guest, I'm just going to say a few words about our organization for anyone here that hasn't been to one of our events. Women's Space Vancouver is a grassroots feminist group. We're interested in protecting and reclaiming women's rights, including the right to retain spaces and organizations that are created for women. We stand for the protection of women's human rights, the protection of women-only spaces, including women's organizations, lesbian spaces, shelters for women fleeing violence, rape crisis centers, institutions where women are incarcerated. We reject sex role stereotypes. We reserve the right to discuss and describe our bodies, our sexual lives, our health, and our reproduction. We acknowledge the intersection of race, class, and colonialism in women's oppression, and we insist on the right to gather and express ourselves without bullying and intimidation. We stand for the protection of children and youth as well. And to that end, we lobby governments, media, and other institutions. We work on campaigns in solidarity with other groups. We participate in public political actions and protests, and we host online sessions like this. So Susan Smith is with us today. It's a great pleasure to welcome Susan Smith. She's a director of For Women Scotland. Many of you here have probably heard about For Women Scotland over the last little while at least. And so thank you for spending some of your Saturday evening with us, Susan. We're thrilled that you could join us. And first of all, before we get into the nitty-gritty, congratulations on a hard-fought battle. Huge victory at the UK Supreme Court, a unanimous decision clarifying that a woman is, in fact, defined by her sex under equality law in the UK. And many of us from around the world have followed this case and celebrated right along with you on April 16th. So thank you. Thank you for doing that as well. And thank you for being here. Now, can you start by just telling us a bit about yourself and maybe before this, and then how you got involved in this kind of political work and organizing?
Sure. So I'm 53 years old now. I've got 3 children. I live in Edinburgh in Scotland. I used to work in New York and in the City of London as a fund manager, but I gave that up when I had children, and I was at the point where I was starting to get back into work when I became aware of mutterings about changing the law and following the Canadian example of moving to self-identification of sex. And I started to read up on it, looked at some things, got involved with some women's groups online. And in the UK, we have this website, Mumsnet, which is where a lot of the women had gathered to talk about this, because it was one of the few places that allowed a conversation on the forums about it. And so few people started to find each other and form little groups to fight it. And I expressed at one point, I think I just said that I would like a group in Scotland, and that led to Trina Budge, who's one of the other directors, got in touch with me and said, we're thinking of organising, would you like to be a part of it? Mm-hmm. So that was 2018 in Scotland, and we kicked off from there.
Okay. And who were there were other women, so you and Trina, were you the ones that kicked it off, and then you invited Marion and others?
No, so Marion had knew Magdalene Burns, who was a YouTuber, who a young woman, a lesbian, who did a lot of response videos to various trans activists and became quite well known for doing that. And she was at Edinburgh University. She'd had issues at the university. And what happened in Scotland was there were groups, but people wanted to keep their names out of the press. They didn't want to talk about it openly. There'd been a couple of meetings about consultations on self-identification, because those had been happening. And so women had met up in those groups, and that was where Marion and Magdalene met. And there was an initial consultation that really slipped by without anybody noticing. And there was also this act that was passed, which our judicial review was about, the gender representation on public boards. And all these things have been going on under the radar, only noticed by a few people. And in response to some of this, I think some of the women got very disheartened at that stage, but Marion and Magdalene said they had to keep going. They spoke to Trina, and Trina came down, met up with them, and then she went out, and Marion went out and found some more of the people, found some more connections. And so we kind of loose group of about 30 women, I think, in the summer of 2018, just chucking ideas around about what we were going to do and how we were going to go forward with it.
Right. Okay. And so just explain briefly in a clear way that those who don't know what the first fight was. You said representation, women's representation on public boards. Was that it?
Well, that is the piece of legislation that's been at the heart of our ongoing court cases over the last 5 years. So the thing that brought us together was really the consultation on gender recognition reform, which is the more straightforward, putting self-identification into law and saying anybody can change their sex by self-declaration. So that was what we were initially focused on. And because the Scottish government had decided that they were going to pass this, and it's hugely complicated, really, because equality, for those who don't know, Scotland has their own administration, our own parliament in Edinburgh, but they can't. They are not responsible for all of the laws, because obviously many of the big areas like defence and taxation are reserved to the government down in Westminster.
Right.
There's a degree of local taxation, but most of it's Westminster. Right. And one of the things that is also under Westminster's remit is equality law. So laws that govern discrimination and so on. But in what was a very odd anomaly, the Scottish Parliament had been given responsibility for gender recognition. So there was a piece of legislation called the Gender Recognition Act in 2004, which was the first piece of legislation in the UK that allowed people to get a certificate to change their legal sex. And for whatever reason, Scotland were allowed to change that, even though it was felt that it would have an impact on equality legislation. So nobody wanted to say what one of these pieces of paper entitled somebody to.
Right.
And there was a lot of confusion, much of it deliberate, put out by some of the lobby groups here, who would go into businesses and they would say, if somebody has one of these pieces of paper, they have changed their sex for all legal purposes, you cannot question it, you have to treat them as a woman under equality law. But then they were also saying, and because you can't tell anybody, because you can't ask, you might as well just treat them all as a woman under equality law.
Right. They couldn't ask for their paper. Is that what you mean? They weren't allowed to ask for their paper. Right.
Yes.
So some people got a paper through an application process, and then the majority of people didn't. Right.
So there was so much confusion because these lobby groups have been misrepresenting equality laws so egregiously and for so long that so many organisations in the UK were convinced that we ran on a system of self-identification, that anybody could put up their hand and say they're a woman and they get entitled to all these services.
So basically that's saying that sort of immediately removes women's rights and women's only spaces just like that, right?
Yes. Yep. Yes. And we felt that this wasn't likely to be the case, but even if it didn't affect them, even if the majority of these people self-identifying as something were not allowed to claim these rights, there's still left this small group, but nevertheless it could be a problem, who might have this right. And nobody wanted to explain it, because I think the problem is, as soon as they started to explain it clearly, they ran up against all the complications. So they talk around it. And we just were looking really for an opportunity to pin it down and say, okay, what does the law say? What is the law? And if you open this process up, are you allowing people to do something that is just a bit of paper that might make them feel happier about themselves? Or is it something that's going to have a substantial impact on women's rights? And we found that excuse to pursue this with the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act.
I see. Okay. And so,
yes,
a small group, a few hundred people have a document, and they feel better about themselves because they're trans and they've got their F to M or M to F, mostly M to F probably. And then there's all these other increasing numbers of people that want to get on that too. So there's the two groups made it complicated. And can you talk a bit about Nicola Sturgeon, who most people or some people here would know, but for those who don't, she was a First Minister of Scotland. So when the Scottish National Party was the government of the day, they got pretty wiped out last time. And I believe she was the first woman to have that job. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, the Scottish Parliament hasn't been around for that long. It's only been around for 25 years.
Right.
But yes, she was the first woman. She's been the longest serving First Minister.
Right. She started out as a feminist and then took a battle for gender self-IDs. Why?
She was never a feminist. She was never a feminist. Politicians have different priorities. She's part of the SNP, the Scottish National Party. Their priority is supposed to be independence. That she had other things that she prioritised. But if you search through records of Parliament, she was not one of the women who was out there battling for women's rights.
Okay.
Those were some of the women, like the former Labour leader, Joanne Lamont, and some of her colleagues, and they were really old school, proper feminists. Sturgeon never was. But she's repainted herself as a feminist. She gathered around her an advisor. She called it the National Advisory Circle for Women and Girls, but she appointed them all. They were all personally known to her. They were all her friends. They all had the same worldview. They all told her what she wanted to hear. And then she went back to Parliament and said, my hugely independent group around me has told me that we need to allow men to self-identify as women, for example. So she lived in an echo chamber on this for a very long time. And so when there was this opportunity back in 2018 to pass a piece of legislation that had a definition of women, I think some of the lobbyists saw their chance and they went in very hard, and they got the definition of women to be anybody who identifies as a woman. And that was the definition. And it's such an obscure piece of legislation, but this definition really mattered because it then sets a precedent.
Right.
And so that was the first battle we took to the courts here in Scotland in 2020, because we wanted to establish whether this was lawful. And in round two,
did you win or lose that first battle?
So we lost in the lower court in Scotland, but we won in the higher court in Scotland.
Right. Okay.
And they said that measures in favour of women, by definition, excluded biological males.
Okay.
And so that was. So then it was sent back to government, and instead of just striking through this definition, they put out guidance that said women included biological women and anyone who had one of these pieces of paper.
Right.
Now, at the same time, they're trying to push this gender reform bill through the Parliament. And they were standing up in Parliament saying, getting one of these bits of paper makes no difference to your rights under the Equality Act. But they were simultaneously in court saying, getting one of these bits of paper means you can benefit from a positive action under the Equality Act. So we said, this is mad. You can't argue both sides. So we took them back. We took them back to court.
Right.
And we lost twice in Scotland, and obviously now we've won in the Supreme Court because they looked at it, they looked at the act in its totality and said it makes absolutely no sense to read this through line by line and think that the word woman or the word sex is modified on all these occasions by somebody with a piece of paper, because it makes a nonsense of it.
Right, right. Perfectly. Yeah, it's clear, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so I know it didn't take them that long to deliberate. Some of us have waited longer for decisions in different parts of the world, but there was still probably pins and needles waiting. But it was unilateral. It was a strong statement. Do you remember that last sentence? The sentence where the man read? I can't remember. I know everybody was supposed to sit there and be quiet, except if they were watching from afar, but it was obvious as soon as he said that one sentence, and everyone's hanging on his every word, right?
Yeah, when he said that they believed the meaning of sex was biological,
yes,
and it was so hard being there on the day, because usually with the Supreme Court you get advance notice. You can get up to about 5 days notice, so you have time to prepare. They wouldn't even give us an hour or half an hour because they were so worried about this leaking. So when he said that, I got this, that means we've won. And I was so excited. And then I thought, oh no, I have to, there's going to be a but. There's going to be a but. So I need to wait until he starts to talk.
Yes.
So it wasn't really until he said the appeal has been allowed that I went, okay, we have won. And then when he listed all the reasons, that was even better, because we've basically won on everything. That's all we could have asked for. So, yeah.
And can you tell people here who the interveners are? They called interveners there, or the people that presentations? Who were the groups involved aside from For Women Scotland?
Yeah, so there was Sex Matters, who are more of the UK-based group, or more England and Wales, and so they intervened, but and they were able to speak. Their lawyer was able to speak during the hearing, and then there were some lesbian groups, Scottish Lesbians, Lesbian Project, and the LGB Alliance.
Right.
And I think their submission was really important, because the judges said that they could not find any way that you can have a protected characteristic as we do under this act. We have different groups of people who are protected, and they said they couldn't find a way that lesbians could be protected as a class of women who are sexually attracted to other women if men with a piece of paper are also included in that group, because it makes no sense. And as Julie Bendel, I think, said, that we're not attracted to certificates.
That's right. I've seen a few people posting that online, not even putting it in their heading on their accounts online, saying not attracted to a certificate.
Yeah, so it was that was really important, and I think because it was so clear, it was such a clear if you can't define sex, you can't define sexuality, and then all these gay rights that we fought for and won just go under the bus. So it was critical, and I think actually in a way so on the other side we had the Scottish government.
Right.
And their interveners, they had Amnesty International, who have let themselves down very badly of late, and the Equality and Human Rights Commission, who are responsible for the implementation of the Equality Act. And there's been a little bit of a push and pull for the soul of the EHRC.
Yes.
And I think what they settled on for the intervention was, we believe this is the law, but we also believe the law makes no sense and it becomes impossible to operate the Equality Act if this is the law.
Right.
And so I think the judges then took the view that, no, you cannot have a piece of legislation that makes no sense.
Right.
You have to go back and say, well, in that case, and if the EHRC is saying it makes no sense, then
Right.
This must be the wrong interpretation of it.
Right.
So in a way, they were very helpful to us. And I mean, we know them pretty well. So it helped us for them to say the Scottish Government's reading of the law means the law is just not fit for purpose.
Yes. And there seems to be many people, including lawyers, politicians, government institutions, that they're not only misrepresenting what was clarified on April 16th, and some of it's perhaps out of ignorance, and some of it's probably intentional. And even going as far as saying we're not going to implement this, we want more information. Well, what's going on there?
I suppose it's when you've carried your way for so long, and they had changed policy and practice by stealth. They'd convinced themselves this was the law. A lot of those organisations, they really did not think we were going to win. They were convinced. We prepped for losing. We had all our positions worked out, and if this happens, that happens. They didn't think
do that.
anything. They just could not countenance the idea they might lose. And I think it's probably the sort of stages of grief. I think they're in denial at the moment.
Still in shock and denial.
But it is troubling because, Stonewall, which is, for those who know, one of the big gay rights, well, it was a very respected gay rights organisation in the UK, and it has pivoted for the last 10 years to becoming more of a trans rights organisation. And a lot of the people who were initially involved in it have given up on it in disgust. But they put out something that said, well, nobody should do anything. Don't change it. You have to wait for guidance from the EHRC.
Right.
And I know it's been driving some of the commissioners mad. Aqua Reindorf's been on Twitter saying, no, statutory guidance isn't the law. The law is what the Supreme Court says. You have to obey the law. You do not have to wait for us to tell you to obey the law.
Well, and it's so clear that Stonewall, they could be celebrating the victory of the lesbians if they were an LGB, etc. organization.
That's right.
And there's certainly a number of gay men that I know online that are celebrating and grateful and thankful to the lesbians for also protecting their rights as homosexuals. Because if, like people say, if there's no sex, then there's no homosexuality or heterosexuality for that matter. It's there's just feelings of who someone might be, or in your case, a piece of paper.
Yes.
And so didn't the EHRC, which is the Human Rights Commission, I think, for Equality and Human Rights, didn't they provide some initial guidance? And what was that?
Yeah, so they put out an interim update, just as a kind of stopgap until they can, because they have a big statutory code which they send out to, and to be fair, their last statutory code was very wrong, because they did used to have somebody as chair who had been a Stonewall activist, and that had been a problem. Right. But they've been they were going to review it anyway. They've been gradually reeling back. They put out guidance a couple of years ago that corrected a lot of stuff in there. And so they were always due to put out their big bumper statutory code later this year, updated. But now they've had to take on board the court case. But so they in the interim, they put out this update, and they said that if a space or facility meets the threshold for being single sex, it means it is only for people of that sex.
Mhm.
And they also said that, you know, for employees and businesses and things like this, they would have to consider the cohort they're dealing with. And it might be, and this was something that was picked up in the ruling, it might be that a woman, for example, who's been on testosterone and has grown a beard and got a deep voice, it might not be appropriate to allow that person into women's spaces. And in with that case, they have to think about providing alternative options for them. And
like a third bathroom, a third kind of bathroom for open to anybody.
Yeah, which, you know, we've always said this is a sensible, practical solution. And in most places, it's completely workable.
Yes.
But we've just seen this week the Scottish Parliament followed that advice. They just put in, they just said they're redesignating all of their toilet facilities in the building. Yes. They're going to have women only, meaning women only, men only, meaning men only. And then they'll have some gender neutral facilities. Right. And as they've said, they can be used not just by people who are trans, but they could be used by, say, this is what I've always said. I was very pleased they picked this up, that if you're a carer for somebody who's the opposite sex, or if you've got a child who's maybe too old to go into a boy who's maybe too old to go into the ladies with you, but you don't want him to go in on his own, that works for all these different people.
Right.
Dads with the daughters. I don't know many dads who would take their little girls into a men's loo. I think they would much rather have this space. So this is a great solution. And of course, now they are going nuts about it, because of course it was never about having facilities and not being discriminated against.
No, they wanted ours.
They wanted ours, yeah.
And it's and them making that obvious and more people learning about that maybe will have some positive effect on the public or on institutions when it says, like, we've got everything provided, everybody's covered, no matter who you are. And then if you say I don't want to go in the one you provided, then you can't say there's no toilet for me anyway. At least they can't say that, because I see they're leading right back to this "where do I pee" story. They're really getting caught up in that. I can't go out. I won't be able to leave my house. Like,
and they're still protected.
Or the gender neutral.
Yeah, and they're still protected in law because they can't be discriminated against. No. But it got a bit annoying in the weeks after the focus on toilets became because we didn't initially fight this about toilets. You know, I know toilets can be very important, especially if for personal dignity. But you know, we got into this because we were seeing rape crisis centres saying they would take in men, and domestic violence shelters, hospitals having men on psychiatric wards that were supposed to be, you know, really, really worrying situations. Yeah. Men in women's prisons, all this sort of thing. That was where we went into it. And when we went into it, we thought we'd just go to the government and say we have concerns about these areas which are probably on the edges, because most people are not in a domestic violence shelter or a prison or a psych ward in a hospital. Can we talk about protections in those specific instances? And they wouldn't. And of course, they kept pushing. So then I do remember, I think it was a trans person who said very early on when we first started that if they didn't concede, we would have to go back to law. And the line in law has to be biology, because nothing else is definable or makes sense.
Right.
And that was very prescient, because of course that's what happened. And we didn't set out to you know, we just wanted to have a nice little compromise at the beginning, and then it all hardened up because they just weren't prepared to bend on anything.
And there's been some fierce backlash in the streets and crazy big protests and online stuff happening. And so how's that been playing out, and how's that been affecting you all and just people in general? And is it continuing at the level it was that I saw online? Is it growing? Is it shrinking? And who's being affected by that, and in what way?
I think it's, there was an initial reaction, and they all went out with their placards.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they can't help themselves. They turn up with placards saying, bring back witch burning, and the only good turf is a hanged turf, and this sort of thing. They just can't help themselves. So then those things become the story. And they were sending us abusive emails. So that also became a story. And I think the more that, and now they're talking about turning up to Parliament to go into the women's loos, or also just take a pee on the Parliament, maybe stand outside. And it's so aggressive, and it's so male, and it's so marking their territory. And in a way, the more they do this, the more people just look at this and go, no, these are not well people.
No.
So it's
peeing. They had a big pee in, I understand, in London. And then they were peeing on statues and defacing a feminist statue and other statues, Nelson Mandela statue maybe, or they're I mean, it's good. I mean, it's not good they're defacing the statues, but it's good for people to see that there's not a lot of reasonable people out there in the forefront, the loudest, the most vocal, and the most violent, really.
Yeah, and we need that, because unfortunately there's still this narrative about them being vulnerable and sad, because our sporting bodies have moved quite quickly.
Yes.
Football and cricket. Rugby had already gone because rugby's dangerous. So they moved and said, nobody in any of our leagues, from the elite down to the grassroots, nobody's going to be allowed to play on the opposite sex team. And so we've had all these media stories with sad trans person saying, but I can't play the game I love anymore. Yes, you can. You just have to play on the right team. And there has been a lot of, there was a brilliant interview with Sharon Davis, who was an Olympic swimmer. I don't know if,
I see her.
And when he was they were just saying, we don't want to talk about how sad they are. Women have been sad for years, and had to put up with all this.
Yes, women aren't being sad enough, I guess, for the interviewers. Or if they do, or if they have been, they don't care as much, because somehow we're not vulnerable. And
they always say this, don't you care about this vulnerable population? And I've been saying, you know what? None of these people cared when it was women in prison, who are very, very vulnerable.
Yes.
Nobody cared about them. And
children in the washrooms, and like little girls in the washrooms and change rooms. Yeah. I know. There's that one is, it's amazing how people have the ability to shut something off and then open it up when it's appropriate, and then shut it down again. They can take things and put them in the back of their mind that they know or have heard, or maybe they chose not to believe. I don't know, but yeah, it's it can be kind of funny at this point, but it's also, I've heard from a few people, including last night listening to Kathleen Stock and Julie Bindel on their Friday Night Lesbian Project podcast, which some of us listen to every Friday. And both of them have said, and I've heard this from a few other women, that they're at the point something happened. They celebrated, they were thrilled, they were ecstatic. We won, women, these, singing the praises of Scottish women. And then now they feel irate and out of control, anger. I think everything is just kind of all the things that have happened over the years, and especially to those that have been attacked or fired, or, which is the case for them. They almost want revenge, and I'm not saying real revenge, like they're gonna go after somebody, but they're just, they're angry, and they're not going to talk nice to people who were on the other side who try to suddenly cozy up to them, or, you know, it's understandable. Have you experienced any of that?
Yeah, I mean, what I've found most is the frustration. So we've won this, we've got the ruling, it's the dragging of heels. So the Scottish government still has guidance out to the prison service, to schools. Should have been pulled ages ago. It should have been pulled after our first judicial review win, because it's all based on self-identification, which was already not lawful.
Right.
But we keep writing to them saying, you have to pull this, you have to pull, and they won't.
Right.
And I think they think if they ignore it, it'll go away. And we keep, you know, we're at the point where we just, well, we'll have to go back. You know, do we have to go back to court? And we would probably rather not, but if we need to, we will. We'll just keep going back to court until they do what they're supposed to do.
And I guess individual citizens can also complain, right? Yes. If an individual citizen goes into a building or a facility or a pool or a residential situation or whatever, where it's supposed to be divided by sex, what would their strategy be? To call the police, to call, like, to I guess first to talk to who's running the place, and then let them know they're breaking the law.
Yes, I think the first thing you do would be to go and see who's over on the desk, or and say there's a man in that changing room or whatever. Right. And you would expect them to take action. And if they didn't take action, or if they said our policy allows that, then that person would have a claim against the facility. And
all of this costs money and takes time and wastes time, and, you know, and the amount of money you had to raise, I heard different numbers. It's a huge amount of money and time in your whole life. I mean, I'm sure that there's been benefits, new friendships, and, you know, working with some amazing people, but it takes its toll on your health, your sleep, your body, your time. And how are you feeling these days?
Yeah, I'm feeling 3 stone heavier than I started, and too much alcohol since I've started.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've had cancer in the interim as well, so.
Yes, I heard you were sick. You had cancer and surgery and everything. Yeah.
So it's. But I think it has been good, because it's given me a focus, and it's so important. It had to be done. Somebody had to do it.
Yes. Thank you for being the ones to do it, and having all that great support too from others. So I'm going to open up for questions, Susan. We're running a little bit behind, but there's quite a few questions here, and I'm going to read them out. No, I can't read them all out. I'll just pick and choose and try and get as many things covered as possible. Mm-hmm. So someone was asking how they could get a copy of or if it's possible to get a copy of the court submissions.
Is that the submissions made by the individual organisations?
I believe so.
I think we've all published them, as is certainly on our website.
Okay.
It's up to the individual. I think Sex Matters is on their website, and it'll probably be on LGB Alliance's website.
I think the Lesbian Project put theirs up there too, yeah. So each individual group, okay.
Yeah, because it's up to them. The ones that haven't been published, of course, are the ones on the other side.
Yeah, that would be interesting too, wouldn't it?